Thanks for having me. This isn't too intense if I use the microphone? Okay. I did a talk yesterday, and I'm not used to giving talks. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to see the new building. It's my first time here, and it's been a while since I've been back, so I'm very happy to be here to be able to talk to you about our work on narratives of racial progress and realistic perceptions toward diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have really fond memories of being at Berkeley. Spent about a decade here, and so a lot of the things that I like about psychology, about being a social scientist, that was cultivated and developed here, and so it's a lot of fun to come back and talk to you about what I've been doing since I've been gone. So this is what I've been doing. So the roadmap for today is like this. So I'll talk to you about sort of my own approach to research and my perspective and positionality on it. Then I want to talk about some of the recent work on misperceptions of racial inequality, some of the basic paradigm, prior evidence for that. And then we'll go from looking at misperceptions to trying to promote more realistic and accurate perceptions of racial inequality. What might that entail? What kind of psychological processes do you have to account for? How to make it so that people are more accurate about how much inequality exists in American society. And then we'll end with some future directions and ongoing lines of research, trying to connect some of that intervention work to messaging about reparative policies, and then thinking about some of the costs of continuing to have this kind of automatic, linear association of progress with society over time for diversity in organizations. So that's where we're going. And we'll start here with sort of this background and research. So when I started as a graduate student, I didn't really have this all figured out and struggled, I think, to find my narrative voice, to find my writing voice. It's been a long time, and thinking back on all the research, some of what is pretty consistent across all of that is this basic question about how narratives of opportunity that can often motivate striving and effort also maintain and perpetuate societal inequities. I think I'm interested in that kind of broad topic because narratives of opportunity are things that you pass down in your own family, and certainly in my family, these narratives loom pretty large. This is Jimmy Yamamoto, my great-grandfather, and so his story looms very large in our family, right? He's about 18 years old. He's living on working on a Japanese freighter, going back and forth between Japan and the United States. He's heard about the American dream on his travels and trips. And he's thinking about there might be a better life in the States, and so he decides in Seattle, Washington, to jump ship, swim ashore. He's about 18 years of age, doesn't have a fully realized plan, right? It's like, I've got some scarves I'm going to sell, and then we're going to just see what happens, right? So ends up trying to find work, keeps moving east, ends up making a life in Camas Prairie, Idaho. Not a lot of Japanese people in Camas Prairie, Idaho. Ends up meeting the Kano family, who's stationed out in Utah. Marries my great-grandmother, Mary. And then they have 2 kids, and they raise them in Camas Prairie. We talk about this story because it's a story that's motivating. It's a story that talks to us, in my family at least, about hard work and effort and how necessary that is to reach some of the rewards and milestones you seek in your life, right? And we refer to this, like in my family, a lot for that reason. But coming back to the maintaining societal inequities part, one thing that's left out of those narratives, like even in our family, the things that we don't talk about are things like, what was it like growing up for my grandma as the only Japanese family for hundreds of miles? What was it like during Japanese incarceration for them living in Camas Prairie in 1941 and 1944. Right? These are the things that aren't passed on in those narratives. And so that tension about what's shared and what's not, how it can motivate striving but then also maintain and perpetuate societal inequity is something that sort of flows through the work that I've been doing, certainly that started here at Berkeley, but continues today with some of our work on narratives of racial progress. So I'll talk a bit about this basic paradigm now. When we think about society, a lot of these narratives become really relevant to us. When you think about how society is progressing across time, how equal or unequal it is, often we come up with a narrative trajectory for what society might look like that tends to be linear and positive in its trajectory and always forward moving. We can often, motivated cognition is this way, right? Like we can come up with events that paint this picture of progress towards racial equality across time. You might think about the Emancipation Proclamation, Brown versus Board of Education, and the federal law to desegregate schools, Voting Rights Act, the election of President Barack Obama as a president of the United States, right? And that draws a bright line, a linear line of progress across time. What we might not attend to as readily in these stories about how American society changes over time are things like how segregated our schools currently end up being, right? How the federal protections of the Voting Rights Act are largely not a part of our laws anymore. So these are the ways that we might tell a story about the United States that motivates this kind of striving and effort, but then by using these stories we might maintain and perpetuate societal inequity by making predictions about what society looks like and where it's going. That make us believe that progress is always happening, that society is always forward moving. So this is going to be motivational, like I'm talking about, right? Like the ways that we tell these stories, the ways that we take on new information is likely to confirm some of these narratives. It's also informational, right? If we have a society that's segregated, which we do, on race and class lines, we might not have the kind of information networks that are necessary to really grapple with the magnitudes of inequality that we experience in our neighborhoods and in our cities. We might also have a lack of information and pressures in K through 12 education, right, that suppresses a realistic kind of conception of American history. So all these pressures make motivational and informational forces really powerful in shaping a narrative of how society changes and how society becomes more equal. So all of this leads to this broad prediction that people are likely to overestimate racial economic equality and also progress towards achieving it. People are going to expect things to be more equal than they actually are. And what we'll do with our paradigm is we'll try and measure people's perceptions, and then we'll compare those perceptions to some estimates of how equal or unequal society might be, which the federal government collects. All right. So we'll talk about ways to measure this like in a second. But we started with this basic kind of question because we're doing a few things with it. We're trying to speak trying to use as little math as possible. We're trying to make the question simpler, and then we're trying to help people come up with a response that then we can compare to federal estimates based on surveys that the government collects. So we're asking something like, if the average white family has $100 of some resource, a lot of times here we'll talk about wealth, because wealth is one of the most important financial resources. If you're sick, you need wealth. If you lose your job, you're going to need wealth. There's a lot of things, especially in American society, you need savings for. To go to college, you need wealth, so you take on debt. All right. So if the average white family has 100 of some resource, how much does the average black family have is the basic question. We'll provide, in this particular study, a 0 to 200 scale for people to make these ratings on. So this is a paper from 2019. On the vertical axis is black wealth and white wealth is $100. So 100 here would indicate that people have an estimate that there's equality between white and black Americans. And then here's the basic questions. You can answer this mentally for yourselves. If the average white family has $100 in wealth, how much does the average black family have? You can do it at today. What do you think the estimate is today? All right, here are people's perceptions. So this is a 1,000-person sample that's representative of the United States in terms of region, race, and income. The individual colored dots are individual responses for each time point. So within subject's design, we randomly order the years, but everybody answers at all the 12 time points, right? And then the black dots are means surrounded by 95% confidence intervals. What you get is a picture of people's perceptions here, right? So people are expecting things to become more equal across time. A lot of variation in where people start and then where people end up by 2016 versus 1963. But in general, what you see is this positive, linear kind of expectation that society is becoming more equal. And then we compare this, so these are mean perceptions, and we're going to compare this to median estimates from the federal government's data from the Survey of Consumer Finances. Rudy, go ahead.
The participants are of white background?
So it's sampled to be demographically representative of the United States in terms of race and income. So 60% white Americans in this sample. It's the largest group. There's a race effect in the perceptions, wherein white folks overestimate more, and so I'll show a little bit about that a second. That said, the tendency to overestimate relative to the federal data that are here, so these are the median estimates. If you look average across all the people, it's kind of like 96% of people, so it's all people are overestimating, but there are levels of overestimation that happen as a function of various characteristics. Things I'll talk about are race and income, also like belief in a just world and conservatism. Those kind of ride together here, and they predict this kind of overestimation that's happening. Yeah? Yeah, that's right. That's right. People are coming up with their theories of society at the present time point. Like I was born right around here, so I couldn't have collected that data in the past. But yeah, they're in the present. So this is like 2017, 2018, where they're making their estimates, and they're trying to think about like they're using their theories about what America looks like across time. Yeah. Okay, other clarifying questions? Yeah, so I'm happy to answer questions as we go. So do continue. All right. So what you see is people are having this linear estimation of progress. What you also see is this overestimation that's happening, right? It's particularly on wealth, that people are expecting things to be more equal. They think things are more equal in 1963. So people think that black families have $50 in wealth roughly for the 100 that white families have. The correct answer is actually 6. And then it becomes present, so even like 2019, we're around $12, $13 for 100. So things haven't changed, at least in terms of the federal data, a ton. But you have people's perceptions that lead to these kind of optimistic beliefs about how equal society is across time. Yeah, question.
Two questions. One, how is the federal government measuring wealth? And they're just asking, like, what's the cumulative value of all your assets, or what does wealth mean here in the survey data?
Yeah, so it's a bunch of targeted questions about. It's from the Survey of Consumer Finances, but they asked about your assets and they asked how much you have in your family, and then they asked about debts, and then there's a calculation that economists do to subtract one from the other, and then there's at least one other survey that I'm forgetting the name of that measures wealth as well, but with a different sample. This one's, I think, better because the sampling is just a larger sample of people, a larger sample of families, but the results of the two surveys of wealth are the same. And then this is medians for the federal estimates, but if you chart the means, it's the same pattern. It's just a little bit better because you've got a little bit of a tail happening that's kind of driving the inequality down just a little bit.
And then just really quickly, this second downturn, or the first downturn right around 2000, is that both black and white families are decreasing in their wealth, but black families are decreasing more rapidly? Or is it that white families are staying the same or increasing while black families are decreasing? Does that make sense?
Right. So I'm not sure about being able to engage in causal identification for what's happening there. Could be a lot of things that are happening for this downturn. For me, I'm sort of more interested in what's going on with the perceptions, right? So I don't have a strong sense of what's happening during that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So we're looking at these estimation patterns, and what we get a sense of from the variety of studies that we've collected looking at these data is examining the ways that people do this across domains. So people are overestimating racial equality and progress towards achieving it across many economic indicators. We've collected data on estimates of COVID-19 cases and deaths, employer-provided health benefits. Doctoral student Brittany Torres has a dissertation on representation and management in some of these estimates. The general perceptual pattern that you see across these different indicators is that people are overestimating progress. They're thinking of things happening and improving linearly towards greater equality, and then overestimating the magnitude of current equality in society. So this is data from the our 2017 paper, and we're just on the y-axis we're looking at progress here. So it's just a subtraction between present and past. Positive scores indicate that people think things are getting more equal. Negative scores are that people think things are getting worse. The red bars are the federal government's various surveys on health benefits, college wages, high school wages, wealth, and income. And what you see basically is this general pattern of perceptions of progress happening. So people think, and these are white and black Americans in this particular sample, that society is becoming more equal across time. And then the data on actual progress is a lot more pessimistic. Yeah, right. Well, so the ones I will present today largely are looking at black-white wealth inequality. We've looked at Latinx white wealth inequality, same pattern that's in our 2019 paper. I think almost the same magnitude of overestimation. We have a paper on Asian white wealth inequality perceptions, similar pattern as well. And then we've looked at, but the magnitude is much smaller. And then those are the primary groups where we have federal data to make these comparisons. The government doesn't collect more granular data to make finer conclusions about those perceptions.
You don't know specifically about Japanese. The story at the beginning made me think of that.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that though at the end. But yes, no, we don't know. At least we don't ask about perceptions of Japanese Americans in particular. Yeah. Yeah, question.
Was that gender different? Gender perception?
Similar pattern for gender perceptions. There's a paper that we're working on now that I'm supposed to respond to. But it's in the drafts. But it's a function of gender and race. It's a similar pattern of expectations of progress, but there's interesting nuanced patterns in terms of gender by race interactions in those perceptions that I'm not prepared to talk about today. All right. It's also robust to some measurement variation, right? So on the one hand, this could be a deeply held kind of pattern of perception, right? That is based on a theory of like what society is and how progress progresses. But on the other hand, it could be just this kind of like these questions are hard. I don't really know what to do with them. And so the ways that you ask the question about like how equal society is can drive the estimates in ways that lead to like, a lot of variation between the type of question and the wording of it and the estimates. So we did a paper on this, which is randomly assigning people to the different kind of question variations. And this is with Kira Hudson, who's a new faculty member over at Haas. Kira's not here today, but I did call her out. All right. So if the average white family has 100 in wealth, how much does the average black family have? This is our control. This is our regular perception condition. We're going to compare it to the other ones. We can ask typical. It's going to cue a slightly different, potentially, distribution of like the people that you have in mind when you're making these estimates. Could lead to different estimates, could lead to the same estimates. You can start with a different reference group, right? Like you can say, maybe it's something about where you're starting from that's driving these estimates, and then cueing a different part of the perceptual space and your schemas about these groups might lead to a different estimate. We use 0 to 200 scales. We could be anchoring. So what if we use a 0 to 100 scale? What if we use open-ended responses? All of these things could lead to wide fluctuations in people's estimates or not. All right, so control, here's a replication from the 2019 paper. Control condition, single time point, you have estimated black wealth and white wealth 100. Again, people are overestimating relative to the red line, which is the current estimates from the government. Here are our different framings. Past anchor, we tell people about the gap in 1963, so there's a long way to go there. Maybe that's going to increase accuracy. Talking about families versus people, right? Because there's different family structures that are more normative, so that might also be happening too. But it turns out that there's pretty consistent patterns here. So it seems like it's pretty robust to question variation. There are a few qualifiers to that statement. One is if you ask people to estimate both the past and the present, so you're asking now 2 time points, what happens there, we think, is that you start to think about how society changes across time, and what that does is it drives up people's estimates. So you can see, like in the first study I showed you from the 2019 paper, why in the present people's estimates of equality were so high they did so many time points. So they're thinking about progress moving forward steadily. And that is indeed what we find here in this experiment. Let's see. What else can I tell you about this? There are other conditions in this study that I haven't mentioned. One on incentives, so we can pay people for accuracy in this experiment. And it does work with some caveats, right? So people who are in the incentives condition where they are entered into a raffle to earn some money, they're slightly more accurate, but it doesn't survive multiple test comparisons, right? So if we do a correction, it doesn't. The significance kind of drops out. All right, it's motivational and informational. I had mentioned before that people who are higher in status in society, normatively, they tend to overestimate more. So white folks, high-income folks, men in one of our studies tended to overestimate the equality more. Conservatism is related to this greater overestimation. That variance in conservatism generally is sucked up by belief in a just world if you add them to the model at the same time. So it's really this component of you believing that society is fair and people get what they deserve and deserve what they get that tends to carry a lot of variance here. We've collected optimism as a general thing, and it predicts here, but not in a way that kind of washes out the effects of status and race and income and the like. Also, general wealth inequality estimates right along here. So your estimates of racial equality tend to be correlated with your estimates of general wealth equality. But again, these are separate effects, and you can separate these out, and you still find these other pieces as predictors. So that's some of the motivational story. There's also an informational piece to this, right? So people who have, so we do financial literacy quizzes. People who are more literate about finances probably have a greater understanding of wealth, and they're more accurate in these perceptions of equality. Tests of a knowledge of black history. So if I give you a quiz about history of black Americans in the U.S., people who are better at these quizzes are also more accurate in their perceptions. There's also something about networks in the spaces that we live in, right? So county racial diversity, county economic inequality, higher levels of those two things independently predict accuracy in these estimates. some of the stuff that we're currently working on looks at motivation and these estimates of racial equality. This is pilot data, so we're still kind of trying to figure this out. But if this is really true, that this is motivated, we should be able to do some subtle experimentation around it and get people to make estimates that are going to be more or less equal. If it's motivated, then the kinds of questions that you ask people are likely to cue different kinds of and parts of the distribution. So in this particular study, what we do is we ask about wealth. So we're asking people to make inferences about wealth inequality between black and white Americans, and we compare this condition to estimates about incarceration, and we compare that condition to demographic estimates, right? So here we're doing all estimating about what the structure of society is, but there's different kind of motivational forces involved in each of these questions, right? In particular, the wealth estimate is likely to cue up desire to see society as fair and just. So that's the condition that should be different, where people should be saying things are more equal, and that black Americans and white Americans are doing more equally as well. At least in this initial study, that's what we seem to be finding. So after you make those estimates, we ask you about the proportion of black families greater than $75,000 in income as one of our DVs. And indeed, what you see is that just asking this question that uniquely cues this idea that society is moving forward towards greater fairness and justice tends to lead to greater estimates of the proportion of black families having greater than $75,000. So it's possible that this is part of the mechanism, right? Part of the motivated part of this. More work to be done on this. Yeah.
Really interesting work, and I like the kind of like the president kind of thinking about how racial inequality has been for years. Have you thought about a prospective study on how people might forecast how this is going to go in the future and things like that? Or sorry,
yeah, no, that's exactly one of the implications of this, right? Is if you have these beliefs, it has consequences for what you think about the future, right? Like how we make change and whether or not we just need to wait, right? Like if it's going to happen, then we wait and see. That's exactly Brittany Torres' dissertation. I'll show you some data on that at the end, assuming I have time. Yeah, Bob.
If I remember right from the great longitudinal plot, there's actually a small group of people who thought that black families earned more. And I'm wondering if you characterize them at all. Are they just a linear extension of all? Are they just extraordinarily optimistic and unknowledgeable about black history? Or is it really a very different group of people from kind of if you put a cut point, more or less?
So we haven't done an investigation of this in the level and magnitude that I would like. But it's about 13% of the sample. That's consistent with Pew data, wherein you ask, particularly white Americans, if they're discriminated against, if they have it worse than other groups, and around 13% of people say yes, right? So it's that kind of group of people who are making those inferences that things are unfair for them, right? What I can say about the data is that the patterns are pretty linear, so it doesn't feel like a qualitatively different group, but it does feel like a qualitatively different group when you think about the implications of them saying that white Americans are doing worse. So, but we haven't done that work yet. Probably high in social dominance orientation. That's probably where I would start, kind of looking at that. What else? That's probably where I'd start. Yeah. Okay. It's also difficult to change, right? So if motivational processes are involved, you're going to have some challenges in shifting people's estimates. So in a paper that Ivy Onyado led from 2021, what we did is we had this condition that was kind of a sledgehammer condition where we said, like, racism is alive and real and now, right? And so that's one of the experimental conditions. The hope is that people see that kind of manipulation. They say, wait a minute, maybe things are less equal. But that's not, in fact, what we find, despite that kind of manipulation. Instead, what we find is that people say, well, if racism is alive today, then the past may not have been that bad, right? So they bring up the past estimates rather than bringing down the current estimates. So people are motivated in some ways to kind of maintain this perception of society. Nevertheless, we thought about some of the reactants and the motivations involved, and we thought about how inaccurate these estimates were. We wanted to forge ahead with trying to think about what it might take to intervene on this kind of narrative of society and improve people's accuracy. So how might we do that? Is the topic of our next piece of evidence. All right. So in terms of this, we do this intervention study. It's a laboratory study at 4 time points. So there's a pre-test where we ask people about the wealth gap between black and white Americans. There's an intervention and a time 2 right after that. And then there's follow-ups. I think it's 3 to 6 months, and then up to 18 months later for the 4th time point. We're doing this intervention because we think wealth is a great consequence, particularly in American society. Having some savings is going to be really important to you for dealing with society's various unexpected shocks. And it's also the domain of greatest inaccuracy and greatest inequality, right? So it's a place where society is very unequal on something that's very consequential, and so we want to promote accuracy here because accuracy can set some of the groundwork for policy discussions in that it can provide us with a common ground for which to think about what kinds of changes within our organization, within society, in politics that might be necessary to bridge the magnitude of inequalities that we have in our minds versus the sheer magnitude of inequalities that the federal government says we have. Right? Information is likely to be necessary, particularly for wealth inequality, because people are so off on it. But it's also going to be necessary for thinking not in terms of individuals and the level of achievement that's needed, but in terms of thinking about law and policy, right? Because it's such a big gap and the magnitude of difference is so huge, it's going to require some structural changes. And so it might lead to a greater menu of possible policies that you might take up. And then, of course, people tend to be defensive about their racial attitudes, right? We were telling people racism alive, and they were not moving their estimates, right? So there's a lot of stuff like that going on, and so we have to try and help people be less defensive by using some of our social science principles around how do we do that? How do we reduce racial threat, particularly among white Americans, but particularly among all Americans who have this kind of narrative of society. All right, so this is part of our community sample at the behavioral lab at the School of Management. We spent some time trying to build out the sample at the behavioral lab to have more of a relationship with the broader New Haven community. So we did a lot of outreach to try and create this kind of sample that allows for this kind of lab space where people can come in and get some money on their lunch break and then take some of our studies. And so then we did this as part of this long-term kind of project where we're building the sample. There's a lot of back and forth between participants and our research during that time. So we get feedback on the studies. We get information about how to do this. We do a lot of outreach in terms of presenting our results to to folks who participated, and then people sign up for updates for the study, for instance, as we move forward. So that in part explains why the lab sample here is pretty diverse, right? So it's a majority non-white people of color sample. Age 18 to 63, some college. There's attrition in the study from time 1 to time 4. Attrition does not seem to affect our results in that the attrition happens from all 3 of our experimental conditions pretty equally. There doesn't seem to be any predictors that we at least measure that are accounting for it. So it's one of those things that I could tell you much more about, but you may be less interested in hearing. Arthur.
The slightly liberal thing. What is the range? And what is the scale?
It's a 1 to 7 scale, and then so 7 is conservative, and so it's slightly liberal, but just slightly. Yeah. And then, so this is the structure of intervention. So the first part and the last part are to reduce defensiveness for people, right? So one of the first things we talk about is what's shared between the people who are taking part in the survey, which is that, like, you know, having inequalities in society is damaging for our seeking of opportunities, the opportunities that we all want, right? So this is a way to kind of start off people thinking about common group identities and common ground between them before we start talking about differences in resources between people. And then the back end, there's a lot of work from political science, from Josh Cow's work, looking at non-judgmental listening in political canvassing as a way to help people be less defensive. So it's not us just exposing people to information. It's us providing this information, then saying and asking some questions, and then taking down notes, right? So it's like, how do you respond to this? How does it relate to you and your family experiences? What kind of policies would you be interested in supporting, knowing what you know from our research here? I think I'll have a little time. I'll show you some both qualitative and some quantitative analysis of those conversations. And then the three conditions here, we're trying to provide information to help people be more accurate about black-white wealth inequality. The narrative condition it serves as our control, and essentially what we do here is we give people information from this New York Times article about a single black family that's facing racial inequality, that's manifesting in pursuits of education, housing, wealth, and mobility. So just like trying to go to school, also working at the same time, having health complications, experiencing dangers of eviction, right? Like, so these are all things they're trying to do on their path to college. It's a very personalized kind of story. It serves as our control. Our data condition is looking at, zooming out on those issues. So looking at data on black-white racial inequalities for families in terms of education, housing, wealth, and mobility using data. Okay. So trying to say that this is a problem, this is the magnitude of it. In particular, we're giving people the right answer for our question here. We're giving people the magnitude of the wealth gap. And then the combined condition has both, right? It starts with the single black family and the personal struggle with inequalities in society, and then it moves to the data from many families. All right. So 4 time points here. Estimates of black wealth and white wealth is $100. So the time points aren't differences in time. It's just like estimates of present racial inequality between black and white Americans. This is a little different from our prior graphs. The intervention happens here, and then we have pre and post. So at time 1, we have no differences between groups, that's what you would expect. And then at time 2, what you see is the data and combined conditions are the ones that lead to greater accuracy. So a few things. Not perfect accuracy, right? So there's some disbelief about what we're telling people. Maybe also some forgetting that's happening because you're hearing a lot of new information. But there is a significant increase in at least movement towards greater accuracy in those 2 conditions. Maybe what's even more interesting about this is despite our narrative story, people are not adjusting their estimates of black-white wealth inequality from time 1. So that kind of narrative does not seem to make people think that things are more or less equal in society. And then we follow up, consistent with this idea that people are learning something new, so they could just forget, but also they're likely to forget in a specific direction because they have these motivations to kind of maintain these narratives about society. What you're seeing by time 3 is a retrenchment in their attitudes, right? So people in the data and combined conditions are becoming less inaccurate and thinking things are again more equal. And then we ask again, it's September 2020, and you have a stabilization here, but I don't know about all of you, but this was a period of a strange period, right? This is in particular COVID-19, inequalities. People were talking about those things a lot during that summertime. There was also the racial justice movements that there was a broad participation in for people. And so what you get is actually a downturn in the narrative condition. So it's possible that people are thinking structurally about racial inequalities more than ever during that time, and that's what shapes this trajectory. We don't know for certain because we didn't anticipate all of that happening during this longitudinal study, but that's what it seems like might be a reason why the control condition has that downward trend there. All right, so some evidence that we're at least changing people's estimates of racial inequality. I don't know, it's a bummer. Maybe it's a bummer for the study, is like we didn't change people's policy preferences for more equity-enhancing policies in this. They're certainly correlated people's individual estimates, but not moving as a function of manipulation. So maybe more work needed to be done there to try and target some of our interventions to be more closely related to policies. But there were some, I think, promising patterns in how people were talking about racial inequality in the conversations right after the manipulation. So I'll talk about policy right now. So in the narrative condition, what you saw, so they just heard about a single family contending with racial inequalities across several domains, is this kind of focus on individual achievement. So what kind of policy would you support is the question we're asking during that non-judgmental listening session. People are talking about opportunities to be able to go to school. They're talking about success, what that means, how to help more people achieve it. And then they're talking about catching up, so kids catching up, in their schooling, whatever that means. So these are kind of individualized, what can a family do to solve challenges of racial inequality? In contrast, if you just do a word search for redistribution, it only comes up in these conversations in the data or combined conditions, right? So people are thinking more structurally in terms of like their ideas for what policies they might support, but in general, like what are the causes of the racial inequality that they just learned about. So the data seems to be making people think bigger about racial inequality, think about law and policy. And then we did a loop analysis too to look at achievement differences in the word usage, and it shows what we're observing in the qualitative conversation text. Basically, there's more achievement words in the narrative condition, like individual levels of success and the like. People are talking more about that than they are in the combined condition, and then that's pretty consistent relative to the other things we might measure in terms of positive and negative words and the like. The conversations, no matter what condition you're in, are pretty evocative and emotional for a lot of the respondents. All right. So that gives us some, at least, inclination that a kind of intervention that helps people feel common identity, that informs people about the magnitude and persistence of racial inequalities, might be useful in policy discussions. At least in this data, we're getting people to change some of their attitudes about, or at least how they're talking about racial inequalities and their causes. And so maybe with more targeting and maybe applying some of our other social psychology principles, we might be able to do this with policies directly if the targeting is more focused on those specific policies. So one thing we're working on recently is looking at support for reparative policy. So particular support for reparations for Black Americans in the United States. And we are targeting, as our group, to persuade Asian Americans, in particular because there is a potential to increase knowledge for people on racial inequalities by giving information about Japanese incarceration during World War II and something that people don't often are not taught in schools, redress that happens in 1988. Right? So there's redress payments to Japanese Americans for a past injustice that happens. Knowing this information, knowing this fact happened to a group that you may have a close identification with and similarity with is possibly and potentially likely to make you want to have other groups have that similar kind of redress experience. Right? So our goal here is to provide information about that experience to a similar group that allows for people to learn. So information is necessary here for people to learn about Japanese redress, that it happened, the history of it. But then it also creates this kind of stigma-based solidarity, whereas people who have experienced similar injustices from the government may feel similar redress is necessary. And it's also, it's capitalizing on this work on hypocrisy avoidance, right? So if the government has been, it's been possible to redress one injustice, it might be also possible to redress another similar kind of injustice. So methodology here, it's a sample of Asian Americans. There's not a lot of fidelity in, so we could talk about subgroup analyses, but there's just not a lot, there's not enough power to be able to do that. But I'll show this to you regardless, right? So mostly Chinese Americans, Indian Americans, Filipino Americans, and Japanese Americans are our largest groups, and then primarily first and second gen immigration status. Informational intervention versus control. This is not a tightly controlled experiment. The comparison is like a similar informational kind of intervention, but it's about animals contending with drought. So it's authoritative, it gives you new information maybe you didn't have before, but there's a lot of differences, right? So this is like starting from the first step on a climb, an investigation. So a lot of alternative explanations that you could have that are involving, what are all the information pieces in the experimental condition and how they might be involved. And then we asked support for black reparations payments, so cash payments, but then some other related questions. And we used the methodology of other surveys that I can for comparative purposes. The manipulation is basically taking us through a history of Japanese immigration to the United States. There's, again, this kind of common identity, talking about people coming to the United States to pursue the American dream. Then we talk about Pearl Harbor in 1941, Japanese incarceration, and then the struggle over time for redress. This is my grandma and my aunt. All right. And then 1988, Civil Liberties Act signed by President Reagan that provided redress, $20,000 in payments. For the relocation and incarceration. All right. Here's the results from this one study. So the U.S. government should pay reparations for past injustice. What you see is an increase. So this is general, just past injustice, full stop, not specific to reparations for black Americans, but the intervention is showing more support for this. Cash payments for slavery to black Americans, there's a significant increase relative to the control. Not a significant difference for the studying effects, although the mean patterns are in line, and these are all correlated, so the composite is significant. And then this last one is totally it's a surprising result to us, but maybe not surprising anymore now that we have data. Basically, reparations for black Americans will happen in my lifetime is the question, and there's this reverse pattern, right, wherein people thought that was less likely to happen in the experimental versus the control condition. Japanese redress happened over a period of decades, right? And so, thinking about that, thinking about the magnitude and scope of Japanese redress, and then the magnitude and scope across history of reparations for black Americans, I think it makes it seem to people like a harder problem, right? And so that's potentially what we know now with the data. So this is one way that we can use some of our methods to shift policy. I want to end with thinking about perceptions of the future. And so, we have this idea of how society changes across time. We might apply it to our own organizations and our teams, right? So how, if we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in an organization, in a department, in a firm, right? We might have this same kind of idea that then has consequences and implications for the kinds of actions that we're likely to engage in the future. So what kind of policies are we likely to support? If our theory of change in organizations is that we just need to wait, right? Like progress happens linearly, automatically, and naturally. And so we just wait and see what's going to happen. This is Brittany Torres. Maybe on the job market. All right. So in 2025, we're still talking about it actually. In 2025, for every 100 white managers at private companies in the U.S., how many black managers will there be? So this is a question that we ask people. So now people are projecting into the future. What might be, what might we expect for diversity within managers in our organizations I think at the time of this study it was in 4 or 5 years. So you can make your own estimates there. Here's just a small part of this work. This is estimates of black managers per 100 white managers. The Equal Education Opportunity Commission collects these data, and so that's our comparison. The latest data from the EEOC is about 13 black managers per 100 white managers. Census parity, so if we were doing based on census demographics, this could be like a benchmark for reaching some goals for our diversity and equity and inclusion programs. You'd want your firm to look like the community, right? So you'd want it to look broadly like what the U.S. looks like, and that would be up at 22-ish in terms of representation. Our participants here in this study in 2018, so the present estimates of black managers per white managers is up closer to 27. So we're already sort of blowing past the latest data and census parity. A lot of this is caught up in demographic group perceptions, right? People have misperceptions in a variety of different layers here, just about the population of the United States and the like. What I want you to do here is kind of suspend that right now. Don't worry about how inaccurate these numbers are. What I'm really interested in this study, what we should all be interested in, is projections for the future, what's going to happen. All right. So what people think in projections for a number of futures. So one future is no change, so things are just going to continue. What's it going to look like? Our organization is going to make public statements in support of racial justice, so this is not a real change either, but maybe a commitment to values publicly. You might engage in annual bias training programs, so it's just in general like what your conception of an annual bias training program is. On average, so some programs can be quite effective, some can be less so. On average, empirically, these programs are not, I wouldn't hang your hat on, changing organizations based on these programs. So what you see is no matter, these are all light touch policies, there are no change, and people are all expecting things to become more equal, right? So that time is going to be the mechanism with which we become more equal in society. Also an interesting null effect here, empirically, in work and organizations, targeted recruitment, so you're physically changing the structure of how you recruit people into your organization. Empirically, that's an effective strategy, but people are not differentiating here between any of these strategies. So targeted recruitment, this is a high investment strategy. It's going to change a lot of things and probably can make a lot of people uncomfortable. And no change has the same expectation for change. So if you're in discussions as a manager about how to change your organization, which one are you likely to choose if this is your theory, right? You're likely to choose less change, or you're likely to say wait and see and the like. So this is Brittany's dissertation that she's working on, and some of the implications there are not good for the implications of progress, beliefs, for actual change in organization, their representation. All right. So I'm going to close now, and I've said some things today that are not positive in terms of progress. I've talked about how people have these perceptions of progress that are inaccurate with reality, but I don't want to blow by this notion that we don't make progress. A lot of times we can have very small pieces of progress that we materially experience in our everyday lives, and I want to point out that these things are possible. So this is me on the beach. This is my son on the beach just a couple of weeks ago, and my son really enjoyed this Marvel movie, which was like really cool, right? Like there's a Marvel movie, Shang-Chi, and we've got this guy who looks like him, and I think back to this guy. And he would have really liked that movie, right? And so, I think about those moments of progress, even on small things like media representation, and I think about how meaningful they are. So it's not that progress is not occurring. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that progress towards racial equity, equity in general, it's not linear, it's not automatic or guaranteed. It doesn't always march forward. It's something that you work for, that you're constantly struggling for. It can be gone. Just as readily as it can come back, right? And it's something that people work together for, and that's what our research is about, trying to understand and trying to help change. And I really appreciate having the chance to come home to Berkeley today to talk to you about this work. I want to end with this slide showing our team of researchers. I'm calling out in red folks who are graduates of our summer internship program in organizational behavior. These are folks that you're training to potentially become PhD students, but also just to think with social sciences skills and methods. And thank you very much for your time and attention.